Good afternoon. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English Language Podcast. Today I'll be talking about the fentanyl epidemic sweeping the United States, which has particularly wreaked havoc in Baltimore, Maryland, where the synthetic opioid now accounts for more deaths than homicides. And this is really something given that Baltimore is the city with the second highest homicide rate in the United States and the 26th highest homicide rate of any city in the world. Consider that in the state of Maryland, fentanyl-related deaths jumped from 186 in 2014 to over 1,100 in 2016. Nationwide, drug and alcohol-related deaths amounted to more than 60,000 last year in the United States, making it the leading cause of death for Americans under 50. But what is the answer to the fentanyl crisis that is sweeping America? Has the war on drugs worked? Is the DEA effective? Will drug raids and busts make a significant impact on reducing America's troubling fentanyl abuse program? What about incarceration of drug offenders? And fundamentally, do human beings have the right to make their own choices regarding drug use, whether of hard drugs or soft drugs? Drug use is, technically speaking, a victimless crime. From the perspective of libertarian political philosophy, drug use does not violate the non-aggression principle. When politicians talk about regulating vice and so forth, should human beings have the freedom to smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, consume sugar, smoke marijuana, or even use harder drugs? As a libertarian, I'm certainly going to argue yes, human beings are ultimately responsible for their own decisions, but the counterpart to personal freedom is personal responsibility. If people have the freedom to make personal choices regarding drug use, they should also be responsible for paying for their own medical care, and they shouldn't expect the government to step in and solve their problems, or pay for a rehab program or a treatment center. Fundamentally, if we can't control the demand, trying to control or confiscate the supply is a completely futile exercise. But it's more than just that. It's actually, in a certain sense, very counterproductive. By limiting the supply through raids and busts and interdiction, you raise the price of the drugs in question. So, and oftentimes significantly raise the price. Therefore, drug addicts have a greater need to commit economic crimes to supply their addictions. Criminologists and police tell us that in urban areas, a great percentage of property crimes are tied to drug addicts who need their daily fix. And it certainly makes sense. It is hard to envision in America, in a country with so much economic opportunity, what kind of person would feel the need to go out and rob and steal? Well, a drug addict. That much is pretty clear if you look at the crime rates. The drugs and the war on drugs are so related to crime on so many different levels. It's utterly astounding. If we are going to talk about prohibition of vice as a society, we should note that it hasn't worked in the past. And we saw this with the prohibition of alcohol 90 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, from 1919 to 1932. And what happened under the prohibition of alcohol? Well, people still had their alcohol. They had to go underground. They went to speakeasies. Instead of having legitimate businesses paying taxes, providing alcohol to consumers, you put alcohol into the hands of various organized crime and mafia elements, including Al Capone and so forth. And it led to an incredible amount of violence, far more violence and death than would have been caused merely by alcohol continuing at its pre-prohibition levels. So the city of Baltimore has put together a task force to deal with this surge in fentanyl, and of course What they're trying to do is build cases against fentanyl dealers. They start with street-level dealers, they move up to mid-level distributors, and then the big distributors, and they try to get the kingpins. This fentanyl is 50 times more powerful than heroin, and it's very hard to enforce any type of quality control standards. People don't know what they're getting. The drug is manufactured in China. It makes its way to Mexico via plane or boat, and then it works its way down the chain in Baltimore and into the hands of street-level dealers in pill and powder form. There's a very good article about this recently in the Baltimore Sun that outlines every level of what's occurring with this. And the potential for profit is enormous with fentanyl, which explains so much about why it has been sweeping the United States and leaving a wake of destruction behind it. A kilogram of fentanyl wholesales for around $2,500, whereas a kilo of heroin can go for $50,000 or $60,000. But both command the same price on the street. So fentanyl is not going away. If anything, we can expect to see a wave of fentanyl hitting the markets in urban areas throughout the United States. I'm sure it will spread to Canada. I'm sure it will spread to Europe. If there is demand, there will be supply. And we know that no matter how many speedboats and helicopters and tanks and DEA sting operations and busts and raids, we've never been able to make a dent in the drug supply. Never, ever, ever, ever. The only thing that we've done is raise the price of drugs. So this is obviously a human tragedy. What these fentanyl dealers are doing is completely and seriously problematic. This is human greed in its worst form. But what can we do about it? Well, a common argument that libertarians hear is that you put up a paper tiger regarding what libertarians actually believe. Well, libertarians oppose all government regulation. If you're a libertarian, that means you don't want any government, and the government doesn't do anything good, and we should just abolish government. Well, not really. The government certainly has a legitimate place. We have a constitution that establishes what the federal government should do, and then we have a 10th Amendment that says things that are not specifically delegated to the federal government should revert to these states or to the people. Fair enough. One thing that virtually all libertarians are going to suggest that the government should do is enforce standards in a marketplace and ensure that fraud isn't taking place. So let's take a look at the drug market. As with virtually everything else when we're talking about economic matters, we should let the market sort this out. It would be far better to have the government enforcing anti-fraud regulations and quality controls so that consumers would know what they're buying. I mean, let's look at the alcohol market. When was the last time you heard of Smirnoff vodka, Budweiser beer, Yellowtail wines producing lethal or dangerous products? I mean, it's regulated by the government. Hard liquor, spirits generally contain 40% alcohol. Beer generally contains 3 to 5%, and wine generally contains 10 to 15%. And obviously, if you produced a product and you mislabeled it, and it led to someone having an overdose or a death related to alcohol poisoning, well, you'd be facing extremely serious civil and criminal penalties. If drugs were legalized and regulated and labeled and taxed, then dosages would be standardized and consumers would know what they were getting. I mean, one thing where the left and even kind of the hard left and libertarians are going to completely agree is that we do ourselves no favors by having the drug market, this multi-billion dollar business, in the hands of organized crime cartels based out of the Andean region, Colombia, Mexico, now China. What good does that do us? They're not paying any taxes. As it stands now with the fentanyl imported from China, how are you possibly going to compare dosages? I mean, this article in the Baltimore Sun discusses how the fentanyl overdoses have become so serious that the city of Baltimore has made an app so that you can go online and see where the most recent overdoses were that were related to fentanyl. That is how serious the problem is. And when you're talking about a drug that is 50 times more powerful than heroin, which is already an extremely serious drug, you have a world of problems here. But then again, back to the issue of personal freedom and personal responsibility. On both parties, liberals and conservatives, you have this paternalistic element that wants to step in and say, we're the government, we know best for the individual, and we cannot allow them the freedom to make their own choices because they're going to make bad choices. Well, with freedom comes responsibility. You can make a very interesting parallel with credit cards. Should consumers have the freedom to use financial products even if they're ultimately ruinous? The majority of consumers who use credit card products are going to end up getting hurt financially, late fees, penalties, and very, very high interest payments. It's really, for the majority of American consumers, credit cards are a scam. And sadly, most consumers do not pay off their bills at the end of every month. You know, it's the wealthy who have a higher level of financial education that use the credit card products and come out ahead at the end of the day. They get their airline miles and their perks and so forth. It's generally lower income consumers with a lower degree of financial education that are seriously harmed by something like credit cards. So is the government responsible for taking care of the individual, or is the individual responsible for taking care of himself or herself? As a libertarian, I'm going to say that one of the things that fundamentally makes America what America is the principle of self-ownership. You, as the individual, are responsible for your own actions. So it really is up to you. And if you want to make bad choices, you should be prepared to deal with the consequences. I don't think that incarcerating nonviolent drug offenders or drug users or drug addicts is warranted under any circumstances. Now, if they're out committing other crimes, say carjacking or armed robbery, burglary or shoplifting or even murder, you name it, well, of course we should be prosecuting those crimes. Those are aggressions against the rights of other people. But someone merely consuming drugs, that should not be a crime in my book, although sadly, most of our legislators in both the Democratic and Republican parties are not going to agree with me here. We spend $2 billion a year on the DEA, and where has it gotten us? There was a great headline in The Onion a few years back, something along the lines of, drugs win the war on drugs. And it's pretty much true. We've been fighting this war on drugs for 2 generations, and where has it gotten us? I mean, have we shut down the cultivation of coca in the Indian region? Have we shut down usage of narcotics, cocaine, heroin, opium, and now a whole new slew of synthetic opioids that are coming from China? But the DEA budget of $2 billion, that's really drops in the bucket. We are spending a fortune on incarcerating nonviolent drug offenders. That, to me, call me crazy, but I think that is completely counterproductive. Let's legalize drugs and treat the problem as a public health matter, not a criminal justice matter. And again, this is an area where libertarians really need to make alliances with other political movements. There are plenty of people on the left who now see the folly of the drug war, and encouragingly, there are plenty of people on the right. People like Ron and Rand Paul have spoken out against the drug war. Pat Buchanan, actually even someone who you'd never expect, Pat Pat Robertson, the big prominent figure on the religious right, has said that at least with marijuana, he thinks that it should be legalized and treated like legalized, regulated, taxed, and treated like beverage alcohol. I mean, Pat Robertson of all people, but that is what he said a few years ago. Maryland Senator Ben Cardin, who's a Democrat, has said that what we really need to do is crack down on these shipments from China. He said, quote, "With China leading fentanyl production, Mexico serving as the main source of illicit heroin for American markets in the U.S., experiencing a nationwide opioid epidemic, Baltimore and communities across the United States cannot resolve this crisis on our own." Well, fair enough, but no matter what we do with the postal service and so forth, it's not going to work, Senator Cardin. It's not going to work because people are individuals and they're free to make their own choices. If you really want to fight a war on drugs, you'd have to throw anyone involved in the drug business into prison for life and throw users into prison for 20 years. Do we really want to do that? I certainly don't think we want to do that. I mean, that's what they do in countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. You get involved in drugs, forget it. Your life is over. Then again, they have no civil liberties. They have no human rights. They also don't have serious drug problems there because the penalties are draconian. Short of doing that, which I don't think anyone supports on any end of the political spectrum, we have to treat this as a matter of individual liberty. That there is no point in trying to crack down on the supply if there is the demand. Yes, we should have education about drugs and so forth, and we should provide people with accurate information about the health risks. But ultimately, we as individuals should enjoy certain freedoms and certain rights. But we should also be prepared to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions. This has been David Unsworth with the PanAm Post English podcast. Thanks for listening.